Welcome to the Transportation Technology Keynote Conversation as part of Newchip's July Online Demo Week. My name is Andrew Molchany, and I'm the Vice President of Startup Success here at Newchip. I'm thrilled to be joined today by Dr. Evangelos Simoudis, the founder and managing director at Synapse Partners, an investment firm investing in enterprise software AI applications with mobility as a main focus of their investment thesis. Dr. Simoudis is an author with two transportation technology books published over the last few years. He's also the chair of the board of directors at Amobi and is a member of the board of advisors for information science and technology at Caltech. Dr. Simoudis is an electrical engineer by training and has a PhD in computer science. So welcome, Dr. Simoudis. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
The topic for our conversation today is the future of transportation, big data, AI, and their impact on mobility. And we'll spend some time discussing the relationship between transportation, human behavior, and what technology is doing to influence and shape this space overall. But before we jump into some questions, Dr. Simoudis, just please share with our viewers a little bit more about your background, your professional journey as a scientist and investor, and sort of how you explored this space from early on in your career.
I came over from Greece a little over 40 years ago to study, and got interested by happenstance, I will say, on AI, and particularly at that time on the intersection of AI and circuit design. But since 1982, I would say the common thread in my career, whether it is technology, whether it is startups or large corporate operations, and for the past 20 years as an investor, has been data and the exploitation of data by AI approaches. And it has been a very interesting journey given AI's spring in the 80s, followed by a very long winter up until a few years ago, and the resurgence of the field, particularly around data-driven machine learning. So it's been interesting and exciting, and all of the areas that I have chosen to focus on, including mobility, I saw them as opportunities for the application of data and AI.
So that's a great segue to my next question. What about mobility and transportation was particularly compelling for you, just given what you had experienced and knew about AI and kind of the potential applications there?
Yeah, so if you go back to, let's say, 2012, 2013, there was already the beginning of a more broader discussion about how new vehicles, autonomous and sometimes automated, will start impacting our mobility. There was starting to be a new emphasis on robotics, and particularly robots that move as opposed to just interact in a stationary manner. So as you look at that interest, it's not hard to start seeing that data will play a very big role. A lot more data is being generated, and that data needs to be exploited. And for those of us who have been in AI, for some time, the leap is not that great. I think what has been important is the more I personally started getting involved. This was still with my previous firm, Trident Capital, and talked to automakers as well as the first startups that were starting to come forward with new vehicle architectures. And obviously, Tesla has started making a name by that time. You realize that these architectures are primarily software-based. And so the idea of the software-defined vehicle, in the same way that today we talk about the software-defined network or the software-defined, all the software-defined entities, the software-defined vehicle is not started becoming a reality. And as soon as you understand that, you realize that the vehicle will become a great data generator. That data needs to go somewhere, right? So you start thinking about the relationship between vehicle and cloud. And that's actually what gave rise to my first book. It was the realization that on one hand, data and AI will play a big role. And on the other hand, I was talking to automakers and tier one suppliers, and I came to realize that they really did not understand that important leap that they will need to make. So I wrote the first book trying to educate them in a sense and trying to sensitize them to that aspect.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I mean, let's explore that more also. What are the main opportunities you see for innovative founders to kind of shape and capitalize on that sort of integration of software into vehicles? I mean, you mentioned Tesla's sort of established themselves in that space, but what are the other opportunities, or in what directions do you see those other opportunities really growing in the relative near term?
So the first thing to point is that if we're looking at startups that started coming forward, but again, 5-7 years ago, that were vehicle centric, there was a great desire to say that we're going to just create a bunch of new vehicle companies, a bunch of new OEMs, and then. Reality set in, first of all, that this is a very expensive proposition. And I think Tesla is a great testament to that in terms of how much money to take them even to this point. And they're still building less than 1 million cars per year compared to, say, a Toyota that is building close to 10 million cars a year, right? Then there was also the realization that many of the technologies that they were aiming and they were going to be key to their offering were much harder to implement than they originally thought. And this was actually, I would say, a great problem with the overall industry. And of course, the large automakers, as well as other incumbents in the mobility space, were not sitting still, right? Once they started getting sensitized, they start. So fast forward to what we're saying today, I think the most important part that startups need to think about is how to become, we want to use a technology part of the stack, of the new stack, the stack of new mobility. And if you want to think of this as from a value perspective, they need to find ways to become part of the value chain. Becoming part of the value chain or becoming part of the stack doesn't mean that you have to introduce a complete vehicle. You may need to think about becoming an important component in this vehicle. And as I said, as we transition from the mechanical vehicle to the software vehicle, and we're starting to see the vehicle very much like a smart device with a pretty complete software stack. I think the opportunities are actually quite significant. But you need to understand like with every other case, where you're going to provide a difference in how your offering is going to be, as I said, a key part of that stack, a key part of that value chain.
In terms of consumer shifts or consumer behavior, what are you already seeing in terms of the way consumers are, either changing their actual behavior around utilizing different forms of transportation or mobility, or what opportunities will start to emerge from those shifts, given that software focus and the data that can be understood from consumer behavior?
Yeah. So first, I should say that a lot of from an author's perspective, like a researcher and author's perspective, my interest has been, particularly with the more recent book, my interest has been in urban mobility. And I've looked at urban mobility both from the perspective of people movement, but also movement of goods. Because to me, if we want to think about new urban mobility, we need to consider both of those in tandem, not in isolation. So the first thing that we started to see over the pre-pandemic, maybe the last 7 or so years, is the broadening adoption of a larger set of on-demand mobility services. So we went from ride-hailing to car sharing to ride sharing to micro-mobility to micro-transit. These are all different mobility services. And what we have been seeing is that, if you look at the dissemination of innovation curve, these services started being adopted by the innovators, and little by little started aging to the next group, the early majority. And I think that even though we've had a pause during the pandemic, the signs are that the trends that we were seeing will continue. So, and that's global, even though it's happening. And I want to emphasize that at different rates on a city by city basis. So again, even the vision that I present in the more recent book, it's not a vision that I believe that will be realized uniformly across the world and even within the same country. It's a city by city effort. The next thing, though, that and the pandemic really accelerated this, it comes in the movement of goods, and we have learned to have things coming now to us, and that's a big shift. My thinking is that even though we are elated to be able to get out of our homes again and see friends and family and socialize like normal human beings, certain of the trends and the conveniences that we have acquired during the past 18 months will stick with us because we see the benefit of this. And so I think that the idea of so these are kind of short-term trends, and as they continue to grow, I think combined with how cities are starting to rethink their urban settings and how to best serve their citizens, and what regulations they start instituting. You will see mobility changing. You see shared mobility becoming more adopted. You will see privately owned vehicles being restricted from certain areas. Even within the US, where we have such a large percent of the population owning at least one vehicle, you see in the Biden administration's investment in transportation, right, in infrastructure and vehicles and the like. I think these are all going to contribute to the trends, to the changes in mobility.
From a consumer perspective, people don't often think about big data or machine intelligence, when they're considering how to get from point A to point B. People think about safety and style and efficiency or convenience. What should consumers be aware of when it comes to the information that driving or riding can produce and how that gets used?
So first of all, very basically, and we've seen this from survey after survey, with regards to their urban transportation, consumers want, safe, affordable, and convenient transportation, right? And increasingly, they want that transportation to be provided with the right experience, user experience. So when we think about data and AI, our firm's belief is that it can impact each one of these aspects. We've invested in companies that simulate the performance of autonomous vehicles and test that performance. That kind of simulation, which generates a lot of data and requires the analysis of a lot of data, his primary goal is to improve safety. We've invested in companies that deal with the movement of data or the annotation of data. Again, all of this is to make vehicles safer, to make vehicles go from point A to point B more consistently and faster. And so again, data and AI will play a big role on the vehicle side. And then when you think about the relationship aspect of individual to mobility, what we're seeing again, and we've seen this initially with the on-demand mobility services, there's an application ecosystem that is being developed that creates a very different relationship between individual and mobility providers than we've ever had before. It creates a more enduring relationship. So that obviously will throw. We think of this as an important opportunity for startups to invest. And then finally, when you have this integrated system within an urban environment, the applications such as fleet management, fleet operations, fleet financing, and when I say applications, these are kind of families of applications, play a very big role. Or even how a city manages their infrastructure plays a very big role. So these are not only the technologies that will utilize AI and data, obviously, but also give great opportunities for startups to distinguish themselves. So we're already seeing kind of like these ecosystems emerging, and that's where we want to continue investing as a firm.
Let's explore a little bit the relationship between automakers, mobility services companies, and cities. And we sort of touched on this a little bit, but how are these three entities currently collaborating? What are the challenges that exist there?
In fact, they're not collaborating for the most part. The argument that I'm making in my most recent book is that today these three constituencies operate in silos. And because they operate in a silo mode, each of them institute its own local optimization. So a city that controls the public transportation system optimizes around those needs and constraints. The mobility services companies, be it goods mobility, goods or people mobility, they optimize around their concerns. And the same thing with the automakers. I mean, I think if you look, for example, in the case of the automakers, the U.S. automakers, they have been focusing for the past few years in developing almost exclusively very large vehicles, right? Because that's what the public wants. Now, that may not be the best thing for the city, but still that's what it. So the argument that the book is making is that if we want to think about new urban mobility and realize some of the benefits that it affords us, these constituencies indeed need to start collaborating. The collaboration will not be automatic among all three. I believe that in some kind of next phase, we will see increasing collaboration between cities and mobility services companies. Some of that may come through regulation. In other words, maybe more force. Some of it might be more by their own desire. And then later on, we see automakers really joining in that collaboration to really create these urban mobility systems. Because as I say in the book, we need to transition from thinking of urban mobility as a set of silos to thinking of it from a systems perspective, as an integrated system that exists and encompasses both people movement and goods movement.
As an investor, how is your approach, your thesis, impacted by your engineering and science background? I mean, do you identify ways or places where your approach to investing is really guided by scientific principles and in ways that are maybe unique?
Yeah, well, to use a trite statement, we eat our own dog food, and which means that we use a lot of data in proactively in understanding the ecosystem, the evolving startup ecosystem in the spaces that are of interest, and in analyzing the performance of startups, so that if possible to proactively approach them with a financing proposal. Okay. Then we collaborate very closely. And again, this is another distinguishing characteristic of our firm. We form very close relationships with corporations in the industries of interest, particularly mobility, transportation, mobility, logistics. And through these very deep interactions, we form ideas about what are strategic problems which can be solved by startups using AI. So we don't only want to know about the problems that a corporation or an industry or a part of an industry we have, but more importantly, we need to discern which of these problems can be realistically addressed by startups, and for which of the solutions AI will be a key ingredient. Because, as I say to startups that approach us with a investment offer, is to say, if you don't target the enterprise, if your solution is not software only, and if the main IP of your solution is not AI, I don't want to know you. And it's because for us, these are, we're extremely focused in following that, what we are dealing with. And then, as I said, this collaboration between the data that we gather and how we analyze it and the collaboration we have with larger corporations in these industries, I think gives us this extra advantage.
As we kind of wrap things up here, give me a sense for kind of not just from a disruption standpoint, but really from a longer lasting, more impactful perspective. Where do you see, transportation and mobility really focusing in the short and medium term, in the sense of impact that it will have on people and consumers? You mentioned earlier, because of the pandemic, obviously there's been disruption to people's movement and transportation, behaviors at sort of every level. But where do you see kind of the biggest opportunity for some of that innovation to really have a longer lasting impact moving beyond COVID-19? So
I think that the introduction of robotic vehicles, particularly for goods delivery, so whether it is the last mile, the so-called middle mile, or the long haul, will actually, in the shorter term, will actually be very good ways to gauge how quickly we're going to get to the direction of this new mobility. And I would say that the initial results are actually quite good. You see companies like Neuro, for example, or Too Simple, making great strides in deploying their vehicles in a number of different use cases and environments, or ODDs, or operating design environments. I think the next thing that's going to be very interesting is automakers are starting to realize, again, I'm talking about short and medium term, automakers are starting to realize that as we're even if we don't go to autonomous vehicles, but we go to the so-called automated vehicles, where they have higher levels of driving automation, a la Tesla or what GM and some other automakers are introducing. We need to, those architectures that these vehicles have afford now the automaker to start establishing a different and more enduring relationship, direct relationship with the consumer. And that's important because as the price of the vehicle changes, the content of the vehicle changes, the automakers need to establish that, to have different business models and be able to derive value longer term. And I think those type of applications will provide another big advantage for startups to enter the value chain, to enter that stack. The final shorter point that I will make is that, again, whether it is automakers or mobility services companies are finally starting to think of their vehicles as a fleet and not only as individual entities. And this is bringing, and I think whether it is to understand how to provide charging for the electrified and electric vehicles, or these relationships, through these applications, I think that this change in thinking in this fleet-based thinking is going to also provide kind of short to medium term great opportunities for startups, because again, this is very new, particularly for the automakers and even for ride-hailing companies that have not been thinking of the cars that they control, the vehicles they control, as a fleet.
It's really interesting thinking about, at the same time, options become more personalized and individualized, and yet a lot of the approach is sort of more around that kind of group and sort of fleet dynamic, thinking about the overall system, like you mentioned. It's very, very, very fascinating kind of transition, I think, from the consumer space, but also for startups to think about that B2B aspect as well.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I think we're on for a very exciting decade, and even the changes that the pandemic, as I said, is bringing, including, by the way, changes to the business travel. Right? I mean, we see an increase in airline travel during the summer, at least here in the U.S., because people are taking vacations. They want to go see family and friends. But business travel has not taken off in the same way, and I think as we determine that this new work environment, the so-called hybrid work, is as effective, maybe even more effective than the practices that we had before, that will definitely have a medium-term impact, if not long-term impact, on mobility. I mean, think of how many times we used to take on a plane for a very short meeting across the country and back. I mean, all of these industries that were relying on that, on that entire chain, are going to be impacted. And there is some positive impact, and obviously there is some negative impact that will cause us to rethink how to take advantage of it or recoup from it.
It's been a pleasure chatting with you today, Dr. Simoudis. Thank you for your time and perspective. Really, really fascinating. I hope our viewers enjoyed our keynote conversation today as much as I did, and enjoy the rest of our online demo week content. Please join us for more. Like the video below, share it with your network. I'm Andrew Molchany from the Newchip Accelerator. Cheers, and thanks for joining.